witches! So today I wanted to discuss some of the deities that are specifically associated with spring or the spring equinox, which is coming up on Sunday, March 20th. I'm very excited. But I know that we like to talk about deity work over here on this channel, so I thought I would just kind of give you guys a brief overview of a couple deities that are really associated with springtime energy, in case you wanted to maybe have a place of honor for them during Ostara. You absolutely do not have to. Again, deity work is not required in order to practice witchcraft, so I never want people to, one day I will stop hitting that plant, I swear. But I never want people to feel any type of way like they have to work with a deity or work with deities or even be religious in order to practice witchcraft. So no, witchcraft is simply a practice. You can be of any religion, any faith or no faith, if that is what you prefer. So we're going to just talk about some deities, some figures from mythology, and it's going to be really fun. Okay, so the first deity that I really want to talk about is the deity Eostre, sometimes pronounced Eostre. Now, she is an elusive kind of Western European Germanic goddess who is associated with springtime. And a lot of people think that Ostara was like an actual holiday that was practiced back in the ancient times in order to honor her. But Ostara is actually a modern holiday that came about with the advent of Wicca. So there's not really a historical basis to it, but it's still a really great holiday to celebrate, especially when we're talking about finding that balance and honoring the spring equinox and getting kind of in touch with our planet. So it's not that it's a bad holiday, it's just not as old as a lot of people think. So as you guys know, I love my primary sources, and the only primary source we really have about the goddess Eostre is a written account by a Christian monk from the 8th century. This monk's name was Bede, or sometimes seen as like Venerable Bede, and his book was called The Reckoning of Time. So there is mention of this goddess, but it's only a very small passage, and I will read that passage to you when we talk about Ostara in a couple days, so stay tuned for that. But it really wasn't until like 1835 when the folklorist Jacob Grimm really postulated that not only did her name kind of morph into the word Easter, so Easter, like the holiday, the Christian holiday, but also that a holiday around the spring equinox was dedicated to her. But there's no actual like physical evidence of that. This is just a hypothesis that he had. It's a little murky, like there's a lot of murkiness, especially when it comes to talking about Western European deities, because a lot of the times these stories were passed down in oral tradition. So it's kind of like that game of telephone, you know? And this, of course, dates back thousands of years. Like the 8th century, that's a very long time ago. Now, she is associated, again, with the coming of spring and with the dawn, or the sense of renewal and rebirth, which is also like features that we see associated with the holiday Ostara. Some heathens associate her with Idunn, which is basically like the same sort of figure, but in Norse mythology. We'll talk about her in a second. And in modern times, she is specifically venerated during Ostara. Again, there is very little evidence as to how she was actually worshipped, like back in the ancient times, and was most likely a localized goddess based on like where Bede was at the time. Okay, another kind of Western European Celtic goddess that we can talk about is one we've already kind of talked about in the past, and that is Bridget. So she is an Irish goddess who is celebrated at the Celtic fire festival of Imbolc. She is a member of the Tuatha De Danann and was the daughter of the king, the Dagda. Bridget is seen in 3 aspects: Bridget the poet, Bridget the healer, and Bridget the smith, usually. She is very associated with like wisdom, poetry, healing, creation, and specifically fire. So that's why we see a lot of fire imagery during Imbolc. Now, as the Christianization of kind of pagan lands, so to speak, happened, and specifically the Christianization of Ireland, she evolved into this figure of Saint Bridget of Kildare. So some Christian witches actually work with that aspect of her versus the pagan aspect. Of course, her holiday Imbolc, which is kind of the beginning of springtime, that point of midwinter where we're starting to see some signs of life coming back to the earth, is celebrated on February 1st or February 2nd, depending on the year. So yes, Bridget. The next deity I wanted to talk about is Idunn, and she is actually a Norse deity who pops up in the Poetic Edda as well as the Prose Edda. So these are texts that were written around the 13th century by a person named Snorri Sturluson. And in both of these primary sources, she is described as the wife of the skaldic god Bragi. Also, apologies if I am pronouncing anything wrong. I am not a Norse pagan. So she is really the goddess of spring or rejuvenation, and she was kind of the deity who was in charge of keeping the magic apples of immortality that all of the gods must eat in order to preserve their youth. So she is really celebrated around this time, especially by Norse pagans, specifically because she is very much associated with like youth and beauty and all sorts of stuff like that. Freya is as well, but Idunn is really all about like rejuvenation and springtime, which is what we are celebrating around this time of year, especially if you are a neo-pagan, perhaps celebrating like Sigurbrot, if you are a heathen, or Ostara, whatever you're doing, but just like welcoming in spring. She's very much associated with that. Moving right along to a different part of the world, I wanted to talk a little bit about Osiris. So Osiris is easily one of the most elaborate like deity, or he has like the most elaborate mythology, so I will spare you all of that. It really is all about kind of, it explains the succession of pharaohs essentially, and kind of solidifies their nature as a god king instead of just like, you know, it's their divine right to rule, if that makes sense. But essentially the story goes, Osiris was murdered by his brother Set, and his wife Isis, through uses of magic, revives him. So he's very much associated with resurrection, which is a big theme we see around this time. And he posthumously conceives their child Horus, who goes on to rule, basically. He's like the rightful king. Now, Osiris was really seen as a ruler of the dead, similar to Anubis, but different. But also on top of that, he was also seen as kind of a fertility god who was associated with vegetation and agriculture. So he was seen to have the power over the annual flood of the Nile, which was so integral to ancient Egyptian life that it was widely revered. I mean, that's, if you think about ancient times, the main focus was like, where am I going to get my food to survive, right? And the Nile provided that. So when the Nile floods, all of the land becomes really fertile, and that is kind of when the growing season can begin. So there's actually a specific holiday. It's usually celebrated anywhere between like May and July, just depending on the river. But the Wepet Renpet festival is also known as the opening of the year. It was kind of like a New Year's Day celebration, so a lot of like New Year's stuff kind of happened in the spring versus the winter, kind of like how we have. And it celebrated that death and rebirth of Osiris, which, I mean, sounds like Jesus, but I'm just saying. No. So these festivals often lasted for a couple days, which is really great. They had like all sorts of festivities, there was drinking, but there were also some more solemn rituals like lamenting and mourning the death of Osiris. So one of the most famous things that happened was the recitation of the lamentations of Isis and Mithras as a beginning of the festival to call Osiris to the area in order to feast and to be with them. So it's cool. I don't know exactly when it's happening in 2022, but I'm sure that if I did a little bit of Google searching, I could probably figure it out. And if you're a Kemetic pagan, I would love to hear from you. Yeah. Moving right along, we are going to talk about Flora, who is the Roman goddess of spring flowers and vegetation. She actually has a whole festival attributed to her called Floralia. This festival was really seen to be a festival in which people kind of like cut loose after winter. It was actually said that sex workers participated in Floralia and this other festival later in April called Vinalia, which is a celebration of wine. And they were known to kind of either dance naked in the streets or fought like fake gladiator battles with each other, and it was all in good fun. So on top of that, Ovid made mention that hares and goats, which were animals that are considered sacred at the time, also animals that are associated with Ostara, were ceremonially either sacrificed or just released out into the streets as a welcoming of spring. And also that crowds would like pelt each other with like beans and like lentils and stuff as symbols of fertility. So it was just kind of like this really fun holiday that was welcoming in springtime. Following that, we have a very famous goddess who I know a lot of people work with, and that is Persephone. So she is the goddess and the queen of the underworld. She is the wife of the god Hades, and she's also the goddess of springtime and growth and vegetation. So if you guys don't know the story, I feel like we all kind of do, but I will recap. So Persephone is the daughter of Demeter. She also goes by the name or the title Kore, which is spelled Kore, and that means the maiden. At one point, she was playing in a flowery meadow with her nymph friends and was seized by Hades. This is often called the rape of Persephone. So her mother, Demeter, was distraught, of course, as one would be if your child was missing, and was like searching all over the world. She had Hecate help her by bearing torches, so that's where we see a lot of the torch imagery. And when she found out that her daughter was abducted by Hades, she went to Zeus and was furious. So Zeus was kind of like, Hades, you gotta send her back. But Hades was like, but she already ate the fruit of the dead. So she had pomegranate seeds. And she was forced basically to come up with a compromise, I guess. She had to spend part of the year in the underworld and part of the year with her mother. So the idea is that in the fall, when we see the harvest and when we see the earth starting to go a little bit dormant, those colder months coming in, the idea is that is when Persephone leaves to go to the underworld, that Demeter's sorrow essentially causes the earth to go dead. But when Persephone returns, life also returns. So that's how the Greeks kind of explained what they were observing in the changing of the seasons. So I think that is a really beautiful story. If you guys didn't know it already, that was a very quick rendition. Please go read like primary sources. I will try to link some down below for specifically Greek mythology because it's very interesting and very well preserved in comparison to like Celtic mythology. So yes. Speaking of Greek mythology, I did want to just briefly touch on the god Zephyrus. So the Greeks had a set of 4 wind gods that were known as the anemoi, and they represent the 4 cardinal points on the compass. And Zephyrus is specifically the west wind. So he was kind of seen as this god of spring, and people associated the gentle winds that we see coming from the west that became more prevalent in springtime as his personification, if that makes sense. I think we can all definitely relate to that sense of, you know, like spring is in the air. Like I always feel something change in the air, and they apparently also picked up on that. And they noticed that these winds, you know, became more prevalent in springtime and indicated an end to winter. So it was very much celebrated. He did have some run-ins with Apollo, which is really funny. So I'm just like trying not to go into him too much because I can see Apollo just like eyeing me from the corner. Like, what are you talking about? No, I'm just kidding. But yes, so he has a very interesting mythology. And if you are an adherent of Apollo, you should definitely read some of his stories because they're very interesting. Moving right along for our final Greco-Roman deity, I did just want to point to the story of the Roman god Mithras. It's actually very, very similar to the tale of Jesus Christ, and there are a lot of people who kind of draw similarities between them, but they are different entities in and of themselves, right? So Mithras was born at the winter solstice and then died and was resurrected in the spring, but his resurrection in the spring was a point of celebration. So I did just want to mention that, but he is not really related to, he has a different mythos and different origin than Jesus. Like that is a very separate thing. So I can see the similarities, but it's not really there. I'm sorry guys, I hate to burst your little bubble. Okay, and finally, the last thing that I wanted to touch on today in terms of deities and deity work is that archetype of the maiden, which is really the primary archetype of this whole season. So the maiden is seen as an aspect of the triple goddess in Wicca, so like the triple moon goddess, which is a very famous symbol. It can also be, that description can also be ascribed to various specific goddesses, such as, for example, Persephone. Generally speaking, the maiden is unmarried, often virginal. It is a time that is the maiden archetype typifies kind of that early childhood and adolescence that precedes motherhood. And it's really it's indicative of all of the learning that one does as a young girl in order to lead up to becoming a mother and what it takes to learn how to be that nurturing mother figure. Now, I don't personally like relate to that. I will never be like a mom. Like that's just not my bag. Like I don't want kids. So it's very hard for me to like lead up to that. But if you're like me, it helps me to understand that it doesn't necessarily mean a literal pregnancy. Like for me, I'm seeing it more as like like I feel like I am exiting that phase and entering into the mother phase like currently. Like I'm in a very, like this is the last year that I will like consider myself like a maiden, because I'm getting married next year. So like for me, that initiating event isn't pregnancy, it is becoming like a matriarch of my household, if that makes sense. Like I have moved out of my parents' protection and into my own house, if that makes sense. That's just how I relate to it. It does not have to be anything like that for you. And I don't want to feel like, I don't want people to feel pressure to like adhere to any of like the maiden, mother, crone archetypes, because that was one of the things that like really bothered me about Wicca, which is why I don't practice Wicca anymore. But as I have gotten older, I do see kind of patterns that line up with those phases of life for myself. And I'm kind of like doing some healing work about that. So I did want to mention it. If you are like me and just kind of struggle with that whole maiden, mother, crone thing, know that it's normal. And you absolutely do not have to use those archetypes or those descriptions to describe yourself or any phases of your life. But that maiden archetype is very much associated with springtime, renewal, rebirth, newness, and a new life. So yeah, that's my little spiel on deities that are associated with springtime. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have other deities that you know of that are specifically associated with spring that I didn't mention, I didn't want to make this too long because I could probably talk about this for like 12 hours. But I would love to hear about their mythology down below. I love learning things. So thank you guys so much for joining me, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye!